Okay, so this is the second part, in the larger part, concerning with Socrates' response to the charge of atheism. So, before I go on, I want to call to mind something I pointed out at the beginning of the course, that people don't like, or do not tend to like, or to struggle with the study of philosophical texts. And one of the reasons for this is that philosophy requires analysis. But what really is analysis? If we turn to the dictionary, we find a definition like the following. Analysis is the detailed examination of the elements or structure of something, typically as the basis of discussion or interpretation of something. To put it even more simply, analysis requires breaking something into its parts. And that's why we're breaking this passage into its parts, so that we can really begin to understand what's going on in it, as we should be doing throughout all of our reading. But I've used another word that we take for granted, but has a particular meaning in philosophy, and that word is argument. And probably for this lesson in particular, it would be good, as I've said in previous lessons, that you should sit down and take notes as you would in a classroom. So, what's an argument? Because we're not. Let's say what we're not talking about. When we say an argument in philosophy, we're not talking about two people yelling at each other. So we have a very specific meaning, a very precise meaning of the word argument. And to do that, let me show you an example. And this is a classic example of an argument. So let's say I had two sentences. All human beings are mortal. And the second sentence is Socrates Socrates is a human being. You'll notice that from this, a conclusion just flows. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, let's take note of a few things here. In philosophy, these first two sentences are called premises, which is usually rendered in the plural like this. In the singular, you'd have premise. Sometimes there's another S put in there, but it's usually rendered that way in the plural. So these are called premises. And there are the initial assumptions of the argument, stated as declarative sentences. The last sentence, this one here, is simply the conclusion. But what I want you to really notice about this is that if, and I mean if, a lot of times when you say if, nobody listens. So if sentences 1 and 2 are true, the conclusion must be true. So if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. And by the way, that's going to be important in the passage when we see this word, when he mentions that something inevitably is the case, which I think is the next part. I've chopped the passage into parts here. So the conclusion, if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. In other words, it's logically impossible, if the premises are true, that the conclusion is false. So this is the example of this is a very simple example of a philosophical argument. And to really go into this, you'd have to study logic, philosophical logic, which I'll actually be offering a course on, or a set of classes on soon. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. Now, with the basic idea of what a philosophical argument is, and I'm keeping it really, really, really basic, let's look back at our passage part by part. Okay, and so I'm hoping that you have, all of this copied down. If you're going to copy it down, because I'm about to erase it, obviously if you don't, you can go ahead and pause the video and then come back. Okay. So, let's look at the first section of that we were talking about. We see it. Socrates says, "Examine with me, gentlemen, how he appears to contradict himself, and you, Meletus, answer us. Remember, gentlemen, what I asked you when I began, not to create a disturbance if I proceed in my usual manner. Does any man, Meletus, believe in human activities who does not believe in humans? Make him answer, and not again and again create a disturbance. Does any man who does not believe in horses believe in horsemen's activities, or in flute-playing activities, but not in flute players? No, my good sir, no man could. If you are not willing to answer, I will tell you and these men. Answer the next question, however. Does any man believe in spiritual activities who does not believe in spirits?" So again, right from the start, we saw the appeal to the notion of contradiction, which we discussed briefly in our last video. Then he reminds the jurors of what he had asked at the start, that they would not be upset if he used his usual manner of questioning. And that's what we see here. Remember, gentlemen, what I asked you when I began, not to create a disturbance if I proceed in my usual manner. He then proceeds to ask Meletus these kind of curious questions. Notice here that with these questions, he's trying to get Meletus to agree with a couple of things. First, he sets out a very simple idea. We have particular sorts of things and correspondingly particular sorts of activities. Okay, so then the examples he gives, for example, are human beings, which is a sort of thing, and going along with it, human activities, which sounds a little funny, right? But we have activities peculiar to being human beings, right? Flute playing activities. We have flute players, I should say. And we have flute playing activities. And those are just, examples he gives in the text. Meletus won't respond, okay? But then Socrates asks the question, does any man believe in spiritual activities who does not believe in spirits? And finally, Meletus does answer. So we have something here then that Meletus believes, namely, we can put it this way, all men who believe in spiritual activities must believe in spirits. Now remember, Socrates is trying to show that Meletus is contradicting himself. So that what I don't want you to get mired down here about is whether or not you believe in spiritual activities. Right? He wants to show that Mellitus is contradicting himself. So he's trying to get Mellitus to show that he agrees with certain things. And the first thing is this: all men who believe in spiritual activities must believe in spirits. And that's contained in this sentence is contained in that no one. All right? So, with that, let's turn back to the text, which I have here. Go back to Socrates. Thank you for answering, if reluctantly, when these gentlemen made you, the jurors. Now you say that I believe in spiritual things, and teach about them, whether new or old. But at any rate, spiritual things according to what you say, and to this you have sworn in your deposition. But if I believe in spiritual things, I must quite inevitably, remember I made reference to that as important earlier, believe in spirits. Is this not so? It is indeed. I shall assume that you agree, as you do not answer. Do we not believe spirits to be either gods or the children of gods? Yes or no? Of course. Again, we see a reference to Mellitus's reluctance or reticence to answer with this if reluctantly, right? But why is Mellitus so reluctant? He's reluctant because Socrates' questions are driven by the sort of philosophical argumentation I talked about at the beginning of this lesson. And Mellitus knows this, and so he's reluctant to answer because he knows that basically Socrates is setting him up, much like a lawyer cross-examines somebody in court. Okay, then Socrates refers to Mellitus' deposition. That is his sworn testimony given in the trial. And you see that here. And to this you have sworn in your deposition. So in his deposition, Mellitus acknowledged that Socrates believes and teaches spiritual things. So we have a second sentence. We have another sentence here then that we know Mellitus agrees with. Socrates believes in spiritual things. And also teaches about them. And teaches. If you want to add that in. But Socrates says, if I believe in spiritual things, I must inevitably, there's that word, inevitably, believe in spirits. Why does he say inevitably? He says inevitably because the logic of the arguments involved make the conclusion inevitable. Just as it did with our example, all human beings are mortal, Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. So I want to look at how this works, trying to use the same form as we used above for the example of a philosophical argument. So, first, Socrates got Mellitus to admit that no one believes in spiritual activities who does not believe in spirits. So it is as though Mellitus is making an argument, the first premise of which is as follows: no one who believes in spiritual activities who does not believe in spirits. Now so that's the hold on one second. So let me write this down. I want to say something about this sentence before I move on. Who does not Now, there are two negatives in this sentence. So before we go on, I want to make it a little clearer by taking the negatives out. So we can rewrite that once we realize that there are two negatives, right? There's no one and not, right? So that can be rewritten as, so let's just turn this into 1A. Everyone who believes in the spiritual activities believes in spirits. Okay? So we know Mellitus agrees with this premise. I'm going to call it this premise because, as I say, 1a is really just a positive version of 1. Okay? So this is what we're going to use 1a for this argument. Then let's add the second premise. The second premise Mellitus agrees to in his sworn deposition, right? So 2 is Socrates believes in the spiritual activities. So what's the conclusion? And I'm going to put this in red. The conclusion is Socrates believes in spirits. Now remember, what Socrates is doing here is responding, coming up with a overarching counterargument that's kind of comprised of smaller arguments to refute the charge of atheism. Remember, the charge of atheism is that Socrates does not believe in the gods. In gods. So, now this conclusion doesn't get him there fully yet, okay? But it gets him closer. And you can kind of see the noose tightening around. The argument's getting tighter. The counter-argument is getting tighter. So, we already see then that Mellitus has to accept that Socrates believes in spirits. And we should see that this is inevitable, because as soon as these two things are admitted to, this follows necessarily. Okay? So you might want to let that sink in for a second. All right? All right. So now then he asks, once he gets that established, he says, do we not believe spirits to be either gods or the children of gods? Yes or no? And Mellitus says, of course. Right? So here we have another argument. And this, I think, really puts the seal on his counter-argument, or his response, his refutation for Mellitus's accusation that he's an atheist. Right? So we have this sentence that we're going to take from, the other, I just nuked my notes there. All right, so we have this sentence. So let's put this sentence in this next argument. Socrates believes in spirits. Right? Mellitus says up here, he says that he believes spirits to be gods are gods or the children of gods, which if they're the children of gods, of course, then there are gods. Hold on a second. So I'm just going to shorten this second premise by saying spirits are gods, because as I think you'd agree that if there are the children of gods, then there are gods. And then we have this conclusion. Socrates believes in gods. And if he believes in gods, he's not an atheist by definition, because an atheist is someone who doesn't believe